The morning mist clung to the towering Douglas firs along Highway 101 as Detective Frank Rodriguez pulled his cruiser into the gravel parking lot of the Oceanview Motel. It was March 15th, 2003, and the weathered sign creaked in the coastal wind, its faded blue paint peeling like old sunburn. Frank had been a cop for 18 years, but something about this case had kept him awake for the past 3 nights. The manila folder on his passenger seat contained photographs that would change everything. The small town of Bandon, Oregon, thought they knew about love, trust, and the darkness that could hide behind the most innocent faces. If you're following along with this investigation, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now let's dive deeper into what really happened to Jessica and Brandon Walsh on what should have been the happiest week of their lives. 12 years earlier, in June 1991, the newlyweds had checked into room 237 of this very motel for their honeymoon. Jessica, 23, worked as a kindergarten teacher in Portland, her bright smile and infectious laugh making her beloved by both children and colleagues. Brandon, 25, was a construction foreman with calloused hands and dreams of building their first home together. They'd met at a church barbecue 2 years prior, and everyone who knew them said they were perfect for each other. The kind of couple that restored your faith in true love. The young couple had planned a simple but romantic week exploring the Oregon coast. Their itinerary, found later in their abandoned rental car, showed stops at the Oregon Dunes, Crater Lake, and several lighthouse tours. Jessica had circled local antique shops in a tourism brochure, while Brandon had marked fishing charters and hiking trails. They'd saved for months to afford this trip, counting every penny while living in a cramped studio apartment above a bakery in southeast Portland. Jessica worked extra hours tutoring struggling students, while Brandon took weekend construction jobs, both of them dreaming of the week when they could finally relax as husband and wife. On June 18, 1991, they checked into the Oceanview Motel at 3:47 p.m. The desk clerk, Martha Hensley, remembered them clearly even years later. "They were so happy," she would tell police. "Jessica kept showing me her ring. Nothing fancy, mind you, but she wore it like it was the crown jewels." Brandon couldn't stop smiling, kept calling her Mrs. Walsh, like he couldn't believe his luck. Martha had given them room 237, which faced the ocean and had a small balcony where Jessica planned to watch the sunrise with her new husband. The couple spent nearly an hour on that balcony before dinner, Jessica pointing out seabirds, while Brandon wrapped his arms around her from behind, both of them laughing at the salty breeze that kept whipping her hair into his face. That evening, they drove into town for dinner at Clancy's Seafood House, a local institution known for its clam chowder and romantic ocean view tables. Their waitress, Rebecca Torres, served them the house special, grilled salmon with locally grown vegetables. Jessica ordered a glass of white wine to celebrate, while Brandon stuck to coffee, mentioning he wanted to get up early for a morning hike along the coastal trails. They lingered over dessert, sharing a piece of Marionberry pie, while Jessica read aloud from a guidebook about local legends and ghost stories. Brandon teased her about being scared of ghost tales, and she playfully threatened to make him sleep on the balcony if he didn't stop laughing at her. They paid their check at 8:23 p.m., left a generous tip, and Rebecca watched them walk hand in hand toward their car, Jessica's sundress flowing in the evening breeze. Security cameras at a nearby gas station captured their rental car, a blue Ford Taurus, at 9:15 p.m., heading north on Highway 101. Brandon was driving, Jessica in the passenger seat, her window down and her hair whipping in the wind. The timestamp showed they were driving slowly, probably taking in the scenic coastline and discussing their plans for the next day. It was the last confirmed sighting of them alive. By the next morning, when housekeeping knocked on room 237 at checkout time, the bed hadn't been slept in. Their suitcases remained unpacked, Jessica's carefully folded nightgown still lying on the dresser where she'd placed it next to Brandon's hiking boots, which sat by the door, ready for adventures that would never come. The initial investigation in 1991 was thorough, but yielded few clues that made sense to investigators. The rental car was discovered 3 days later in the parking lot of Shaw Acres State Park, about 40 miles north of Bandon. The keys were missing, but there were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle. Jessica's purse was found under the driver's seat, her wallet intact with $63 in cash and all her credit cards untouched. Brandon's camping gear remained in the trunk, along with a cooler full of sandwiches Jessica had packed for their planned picnic at Crater Lake. A half-eaten bag of trail mix sat on the dashboard, and Jessica's camera contained photos from their first day. Pictures of them posing by lighthouse markers, feeding seagulls on the beach, and making silly faces at each other in the motel room mirror. The Oregon State Police organized massive search efforts, combing miles of rugged coastline and dense forest. Volunteers from 3 counties joined the search, many of them young couples themselves who couldn't bear the thought of such a tragedy befalling newlyweds. Helicopters circled overhead while search and rescue teams rappelled down cliff faces, checking every cave and crevice where the couple might have fallen or taken shelter. The Coast Guard deployed boats to search the treacherous waters below the bluffs, where powerful currents and hidden rocks had claimed many lives over the years. For 2 weeks, the sound of search helicopters echoed across the coastal landscape as hundreds of people refused to give up hope that Jessica and Brandon might be found alive, perhaps injured, but waiting for rescue in some remote location. Jessica's parents, Robert and Linda Hayes, drove down from Seattle within hours of learning their daughter was missing. Robert, a Boeing engineer, approached the search with methodical precision, creating detailed maps and coordinating volunteer search teams with the efficiency he brought to aircraft design. Linda, a nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, set up a command center at the local church, fielding calls from psychics, well-meaning strangers, and genuine tips alike. They refused to give up hope, convinced their responsible, level-headed daughter would never simply vanish without explanation. Linda had raised Jessica to be cautious, to always let someone know where she was going, and Jessica had called her parents from the motel on their first night to let them know they'd arrived safely. Brandon's family faced their own anguish from their home in Portland's working-class Selwood neighborhood. His mother, Carol Walsh, was a single parent who had raised 3 boys after their father abandoned the family when Brandon was 12. She'd watched her eldest son work 2 jobs to put himself through trade school, never complaining, always helping his younger brothers with homework or driving them to baseball practice in their ancient station wagon. Brandon would never abandon Jessica, she told anyone who would listen, her voice breaking with each repetition. He loved that girl more than life itself. He was already talking about buying a house, about having kids. Something terrible happened to them, and we need to find out what. Carol had seen Brandon just 2 days before the wedding, helping him pick out a surprise gift for Jessica, a delicate silver necklace with a small heart pendant that he planned to give her on their first anniversary. The case attracted regional media attention, with Jessica and Brandon's wedding photo appearing on television screens across the Pacific Northwest. The image showed them cutting their cake at the church reception hall, Jessica laughing as Brandon playfully smeared frosting on her nose while their families cheered in the background. Their joy was so genuine, so pure, that it made their disappearance even more heartbreaking. Tips poured in from across Oregon and Washington, reported sightings at rest stops, restaurants, even a ferry terminal in Seattle where someone swore they'd seen a couple matching their description boarding a boat to the San Juan Islands. Each lead was investigated thoroughly, with detectives driving hundreds of miles to interview witnesses and examine security footage, but none led to any trace of the missing couple. As weeks turned to months, theories began to emerge among investigators and the media. Some detectives suspected the couple had encountered foul play during their evening drive, possibly from someone looking to rob tourists who might be carrying vacation money or expensive camera equipment. Others wondered if they'd stopped to help a stranded motorist and been victimized by someone posing as a traveler in distress, a tactic that had been used in other highway crimes across the region. The more cynical investigators quietly speculated about murder-suicide, or even the possibility that the couple had staged their own disappearance, though family members vehemently rejected such suggestions, pointing to Brandon and Jessica's joint bank account, their apartment lease, and Jessica's teaching contract for the fall semester. A year passed, then 2, then 5, and still no answers emerged. The case went cold, relegated to a filing cabinet in the sheriff's office, alongside dozens of other unsolved mysteries that haunted rural Oregon. Jessica and Brandon's families held memorial services on the anniversary of their disappearance, though they couldn't bring themselves to use the word funeral without bodies to bury. Robert Hayes hired private investigators who found no new evidence, despite spending thousands of dollars on searches and interviews. Linda Hayes started a support group for families of missing persons, meeting every Thursday evening in the basement of their Seattle church, turning her grief into a mission to help others facing similar nightmares of not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. The Motel Room 237 became an unofficial shrine to the missing couple. Martha Hensley, the desk clerk, would sometimes find flowers left outside the door by strangers who had heard the story on the news or read about it in true crime magazines. She kept the room exactly as it had been that night in 1991, down to the complimentary chocolates on the pillows and the tourism brochures scattered on the small table where Jessica had planned their daily activities. "Someday," Martha would say to anyone who asked about the couple, "someone will come forward with answers, and when they do, I want to remember Jessica and Brandon exactly as they were, full of hope and love and excited about spending their lives together." Local teenagers created urban legends around the disappearance, telling ghost stories about seeing the couple's spirits walking the beach at sunset, still holding hands and searching for their way back to the motel. But for those who knew them personally, their families, friends, co-workers, and church congregation, Jessica and Brandon remained heartbreakingly real rather than mythical figures. They were two young people whose lives had been cut short just as their greatest adventure together was beginning, leaving behind empty spaces at family dinners, unused wedding gifts still in boxes, and dreams that would never be fulfilled. Their families aged, their friends moved away, and started families of their own. But the questions remained constant and painful. What happened on that coastal highway 12 years ago? Who or what had torn apart two lives so perfectly intertwined? Had they suffered, or had death come quickly? Were their bodies somewhere in the vast Oregon wilderness, or had they been disposed of in the ocean where the tides would carry away all evidence? The not knowing was its own special kind of torture, preventing the grieving process from ever truly beginning. Detective Rodriguez had been assigned to cold cases for the past 3 years, methodically working through Oregon's most puzzling unsolved mysteries with the patience of someone who understood that justice sometimes took decades to achieve. The Walsh case file had grown thick with dead-end leads, false confessions from attention seekers looking for their 15 minutes of fame, and the desperate theories of grieving families who couldn't accept that sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason at all. But Frank had a reputation for persistence, earned through years of staying with cases that other detectives had written off as unsolvable. And something about the couple's disappearance nagged at him like a splinter under the skin. The randomness of it bothered him more than anything else. In his experience, successful predators usually had patterns, methods that could be traced and analyzed, hunting grounds they returned to again and again. This case felt different somehow, more personal, as if the perpetrator had specifically targeted Jessica and Brandon rather than simply taking advantage of an opportunity. Frank had spent hours studying their background, looking for enemies, debts, or secrets that might explain why someone would want to harm them, but they appeared to be exactly what they seemed. Two ordinary young people in love, with no connection to drugs, gambling, or any other criminal activity that might have put them in danger. The breakthrough that would finally solve the case came from the most unexpected source possible: a deathbed confession in a Portland hospital room. 3 weeks earlier, a man named Eugene Kramer, dying of lung cancer at age 68, had called for a Catholic priest to perform last rites, then surprised everyone by demanding to speak with police about crimes he claimed to have committed decades earlier. What he told them in his final hours would unravel a web of deception and violence that stretched back not just to 1991, but to a pattern of predatory behavior that had claimed other victims across the Pacific Northwest, turning Eugene Kramer into one of the region's most prolific serial killers, despite never having been suspected by law enforcement. Eugene Kramer had worked as a mechanic at Morrison's truck stop outside of Coos Bay in 1991, a sprawling facility that served long-haul truckers and tourists traveling Highway 101. He lived alone in a rusted trailer behind the garage, a bitter, increasingly unstable man with a history of violent tendencies and a deep resentment toward young couples whose happiness reminded him of his own spectacular failures in relationships. His ex-wife, Patricia, had left him 5 years earlier after a particularly violent argument, taking their 2 young children and moving to Sacramento to escape his increasingly erratic behavior, drunken rages, and threats of violence that had escalated from verbal abuse to thrown dishes to a broken arm that Patricia had explained away to doctors as a fall downstairs. The divorce had stripped Eugene of everything he valued or thought he deserved, leaving him with nothing but rage, alcohol, and a growing obsession with destroying what he couldn't have for himself. Court records showed that Patricia had been granted a restraining order after Eugene had shown up at her new apartment in California, drunk and carrying a tire iron, demanding that she return home with the children. The incident had resulted in a brief jail stay and a prohibition from contacting his family, which only deepened his resentment toward couples who seemed to have achieved the happiness that had been denied to him through what he viewed as his wife's selfishness and disloyalty. The confession came slowly, delivered in a raspy voice weakened by months of chemotherapy and the mechanical respirator that kept Eugene alive long enough to tell his story. Detective Maria Santos, who had driven to Portland specifically to interview the dying man after receiving a call from the hospital chaplain, recorded every word as Kramer described his crimes with disturbing clarity and an almost clinical detachment that suggested he had relived these moments many times over the years. He remembered details that only the killer could possibly know. The exact contents of Jessica's purse, the brand of hiking boots Brandon wore, the song that had been playing on their car radio when he forced them off Highway 101, even the specific words Jessica had used when begging for their lives. On the night of June 18, 1991, Eugene had been drinking heavily at Murphy's Tavern, a roadhouse frequented by truckers and local workers, when he noticed the young couple through the window of Clancy's seafood house across the street. He watched Jessica and Brandon enjoying their romantic dinner, observing their obvious happiness and affection through the restaurant's large windows while nursing his 4th whiskey and feeling his anger build with each laugh, each tender gesture, each moment of joy that reminded him of what Patricia had taken away from him when she left. When they finished dinner and walked hand in hand to their car, Eugene made an impulsive decision that would destroy multiple lives. He would follow them and take away their happiness, just as his had been taken away. According to his confession, Eugene had initially planned only to rob them, figuring that naive honeymooners from the city might be carrying substantial cash for their week-long vacation. He'd noticed Brandon's new-looking watch and Jessica's wedding ring sparkling in the restaurant's light, and his alcohol-clouded judgment convinced him that relieving them of their valuables would somehow balance the scales of justice in his favor. But when he forced their car off the road near a secluded pullout overlooking the ocean, something far more sinister took control of his actions, a rage that had been building for years and finally found an outlet in two innocent victims whose only crime was being visible and vulnerable. Eugene's voice grew even weaker as he described the terror in Jessica and Brandon's eyes when he approached their car with a sawed-off shotgun, how they'd initially thought he might be a police officer or park ranger until they saw the weapon and realized their honeymoon had become a nightmare. He forced them at gunpoint to drive their own car deeper into the coastal forest, following logging roads that led far from any chance of rescue or discovery, roads he knew from years of illegal dumping and solitary drinking in the wilderness where no one could hear his rage or witness his self-pity. He'd chosen his killing ground carefully, a remote clearing in the Siuslaw National Forest, where the canopy was so thick that search helicopters couldn't see the ground, and where the nearest hiking trail was more than 5 miles away through terrain so difficult that even experienced backpackers rarely ventured there. The spot was accessible only by a series of abandoned logging roads that had been closed to public access for decades, roads that Eugene knew from his youth when he'd worked briefly for a timber company before being fired for fighting with co-workers and showing up drunk to operate dangerous equipment. There, surrounded by towering evergreens and the absolute silence of the deep woods, Eugene had forced Jessica and Brandon out of their car and made them face the reality that their honeymoon was going to end in the worst possible way. Jessica had begged for their lives, promising they wouldn't identify him if he let them go, offering him their wedding rings, the small amount of cash they carried, even their car, if he would just allow them to walk away and forget this had ever happened. Brandon had tried to shield his wife with his own body, telling Eugene to take whatever he wanted, but to let Jessica go unharmed, that she had never hurt anyone and didn't deserve whatever Eugene was planning to do. The mechanic described their final moments with the same chilling detachment he might have used to describe changing a tire, as if the brutal murder of two innocent people was just another mechanical process to be completed efficiently. He'd shot Brandon first, wanting Jessica to witness her husband's death before killing her as well, explaining to Detective Santos that he wanted them both to experience the kind of devastating loss that he'd felt when Patricia left him. He'd forced them to walk to a spot where the forest floor was soft enough for digging, then made them kneel side by side before executing them with the sawed-off shotgun he kept in his truck for what he called varmint control. Eugene had come prepared for disposing of bodies, his truck loaded with shovels, quicklime, and heavy plastic tarps, tools he'd used before, according to his confession, though he refused to provide details about other victims until Detective Santos promised him that his cooperation might result in a more comfortable final few days in the hospital. He buried Jessica and Brandon in shallow graves that he dug himself, working through the night by the light of a battery-powered lantern, then covered the site with fallen logs and brush in a pattern that looked natural to anyone who might stumble across the area. After hiding the bodies, Eugene drove their rental car to Shore Acres State Park, where he wiped it clean of fingerprints and any other evidence that might connect him to the crime. He'd walked the 12 miles back through the forest to retrieve his truck, arriving at Morrison's truck stop just as his co-workers were beginning another shift, washing the blood from his hands and clothes in the employee restroom while making small talk about the weather and complaining about his hangover from the night before. Detective Rodriguez spent the following 3 weeks meticulously verifying every detail of Eugene's confession, treating it with the skepticism that experience had taught him to apply to deathbed confessions, which were often either completely fabricated or contained just enough truth to be believable while hiding the real facts of a case. But Eugene's story checked out in ways that would have been impossible to fake or guess. Soil samples from the mechanic's old trailer site matched dirt composition from the specific area of the Coastlines National Forest he'd described, and a metal detector search of the property where Eugene had lived uncovered Jessica's wedding ring and Brandon's watch, buried in a coffee can beneath what had once been his trailer's front steps. The jewelry had been wrapped in a piece of Jessica's honeymoon dress that Eugene had kept as a souvenir, a gruesome trophy that he'd apparently looked at periodically over the years as a reminder of the night when he'd finally gotten revenge against happiness itself. The fabric still showed traces of Jessica's perfume, a detail that broke Detective Rodriguez's composure when he opened the evidence bag and caught a whiff of the scent that had probably been the last thing Brandon smelled before dying. Most convincingly, Eugene was able to lead investigators to within 50 yards of the actual burial site, his memory remarkably clear despite the passage of 12 years and his deteriorating physical and mental condition. Even from his hospital bed, connected to machines that were keeping him alive one day at a time, he could describe the exact route through the forest, the specific landmarks he'd used to remember the location, and the particular arrangement of fallen trees that marked where he'd hidden his victims. It was the kind of detailed geographical knowledge that could only come from someone who had actually been there, who had spent hours at the site completing the grisly work of murder and disposal. The recovery operation took 4 days, with forensic specialists from the Oregon State Crime Lab carefully excavating the site Eugene had described, while photographers documented every step of the process for the eventual prosecution that would never come. The team used ground-penetrating radar to confirm the presence of human remains before beginning the delicate process of exhumation, treating Jessica and Brandon's final resting place with the respect and dignity they'd been denied in death. When investigators finally uncovered the graves, they found the couple exactly as Eugene had described, buried side by side in graves barely 3 feet deep, their skeletal remains still partially clothed in the outfits they'd worn to their romantic dinner on what should have been the first night of their new life together. Jessica's remains still wore fragments of her honeymoon dress, the cheerful floral pattern now faded to ghostly colors after 12 years of exposure to soil and moisture. Brandon's skull showed the devastating damage from a close-range shotgun blast, while Jessica's remains revealed that she'd been shot in the back as she tried to run into the forest, probably in a desperate final attempt to escape her killer's rage. The physical evidence perfectly matched every horrific detail of Eugene's confession, confirming what investigators had already begun to suspect. They were dealing with a killer who had not only committed these murders, but had taken psychological pleasure in reliving them over the years. DNA testing officially confirmed the identities, finally giving Jessica and Brandon's families the closure they'd sought for over a decade of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. But with that closure came a terrible knowledge that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The understanding that their loved ones' final hours had been filled with unimaginable terror and pain. Their dreams of a life together destroyed by a complete stranger's inexplicable hatred of happiness itself. Linda Hayes collapsed when Detective Rodriguez delivered the news at her Seattle home on a gray Thursday morning, her husband Robert catching her as 12 years of hoped-for reunions and imagined scenarios crumbled into the reality of senseless, brutal murder. They'd never stopped believing, despite all evidence to the contrary, that Jessica might someday walk through their front door with an incredible story of survival, amnesia, or kidnapping, anything that would explain her absence without requiring them to accept that their daughter had died in fear and pain in a lonely forest clearing. Now they had to confront the fact that Jessica had spent her final moments not planning their future together or dreaming of children and anniversaries, but calling out for help that would never come in a place so remote and carefully chosen that her voice couldn't possibly reach another human being who might have saved her. Carol Walsh received the devastating news at her job as a cafeteria supervisor at a Portland elementary school, where she'd worked for 15 years serving lunch to children who reminded her daily of the grandchildren she'd never have from her murdered son. The school principal had to escort her to a private office as she broke down completely, finally understanding that Brandon had spent his last moments on Earth not building the home he'd dreamed of sharing with Jessica, but trying desperately and unsuccessfully to protect the woman he'd married just 5 days earlier from a killer's inexplicable rage. The knowledge that Brandon had died as he'd lived, putting others before himself, trying to shield those he loved from harm, provided little comfort against the magnitude of the loss and the terrible randomness of the violence that had destroyed two families' futures in a single night of drunken fury. Eugene Kramer died 6 days after his confession, taking with him the exact locations of other victims and the full extent of his crimes across the Pacific Northwest. His death prevented the trial that might have provided additional closure for Jessica and Brandon's families, but it also spared them the ordeal of hearing even more details about their loved ones' final moments. Details that would have served no purpose except to inflict additional psychological wounds on people who had already suffered far more than anyone should have to bear. The investigation that followed Eugene's death revealed that he had been a suspect in at least 7 other similar cases across Oregon, Northern California, and Washington state between 1985 and 1996. Young couples traveling isolated highways had disappeared without explanation. Their bodies never found, their cases eventually relegated to cold case files when leads ran out and public attention moved on to fresher tragedies. Eugene's work as a truck stop mechanic had given him both mobility and intimate knowledge of remote areas, perfect for disposing of evidence, while his interactions with travelers had provided him with potential victims and information about their plans and destinations. His confession had mentioned other times when he'd been tempted by happiness, describing a pattern of stalking young couples at restaurants, motels, and scenic overlooks, studying their behavior and following them to isolated locations where he could attack without witnesses. But Eugene had refused to provide specific details about additional victims, unless Detective Santos agreed to certain conditions regarding his medical care and funeral arrangements, negotiations that became moot when his condition deteriorated rapidly and he lost consciousness for the final time. Detective Rodriguez found himself permanently changed by the case, haunted not just by the brutality of the crimes but by their complete randomness and preventability. Jessica and Brandon hadn't been targeted for any reason beyond being young, happy, and visible to a predator who fed on destroying the innocence and joy that he'd never been able to achieve or maintain in his own life. Their love had made them a target, their obvious happiness an invitation to violence from someone who couldn't bear to see others possess what he'd lost through his own failures and poor choices. There had been no way for the couple to prevent their fate. No warning signs they could have recognized or heeded, no different choices that would have saved their lives from a killer who had selected them essentially at random from among dozens of other couples he'd observed and followed over the years. The knowledge that such violence could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time, without reason or warning, challenged Detective Rodriguez's faith in justice and order in ways that would affect his approach to law enforcement for the remainder of his career. The media attention that followed the case's resolution was intense but generally respectful, with local and national news outlets focusing on Jessica and Brandon's love story and their family's long search for answers rather than dwelling on the grisly details of their deaths. Television producers and true crime writers approached the families about book and movie deals, but Robert and Linda Hayes declined all such offers, believing that their daughter's memory should be honored through action rather than entertainment. The coverage did help solve 2 additional cold cases when viewers recognized similarities to other disappearances that had occurred during Eugene Kramer's active period, leading to the discovery of additional victims who had crossed paths with the truck stop mechanic during his years of predatory violence. Families in 3 states finally received the closure that the Hayes and Walsh families had found, though that closure came with the same terrible knowledge of how their loved ones had died and why they'd been targeted by a stranger's rage. A joint task force was created by law enforcement agencies in Oregon, California, and Washington to investigate other cases potentially linked to Eugene Kramer using geographic profiling, timeline analysis, and the limited information from his confession to identify patterns in highway-related disappearances. The investigation ultimately connected Eugene to 9 additional murders, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in Pacific Northwest history, despite having operated largely under law enforcement's radar for more than a decade. Using the investigative techniques and interagency cooperation protocols developed during the Walsh case, the task force was able to solve several other long, cold cases involving missing travelers, bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers about their missing loved ones. The case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached missing persons investigations, especially those involving tourists and travelers on isolated highways, leading to the development of rapid response systems and improved communication between agencies in different states and jurisdictions. Martha Hensley, the motel clerk who had checked Jessica and Brandon into room 237 on what should have been the first night of their honeymoon, attended their funeral services 12 years after she'd last seen them alive, walking hand in hand toward their car in the motel parking lot. She brought with her the guest registry page they'd signed, their signatures forever preserving the excitement and happiness they'd felt about starting their married life together in a place where they'd expected to create their first memories as husband and wife. "I kept it all this time," she told their families through tears, "because I knew someday you'd want to see how excited they were, how much they loved each other, how they couldn't wait to begin their adventure together. They were so happy that night, so full of plans and dreams. I wanted you to remember that happiness, not just the sadness of how their story ended." The funeral drew hundreds of mourners from across Oregon and Washington, including many people who had never met the couple but had been touched by their story through years of media coverage and their family's advocacy work. Teachers from Jessica's school brought flowers picked by her former kindergarten students, now teenagers who still remembered their beloved teacher's patience and kindness. Construction workers from Brandon's company served as pallbearers, honoring a foreman who had always looked out for his crew's safety and welfare, who had earned respect through fairness and hard work rather than intimidation or favoritism. The service celebrated Jessica and Brandon's love while acknowledging the terrible way their story had ended, focusing on the 5 days they'd had as husband and wife rather than the 12 years their families had spent, wondering what had happened to them. Their pastor spoke about love that transcends death, while family members shared memories of the couple's courtship, their excitement about their future together, and their dreams of children, a house with a garden, and growing old together in the same church where they'd been married.